The Appalachian Trail had always been a dream of mine. I'd read the stories, watched the documentaries, and even joined a few online forums dedicated to hikers and adventurers who had conquered the nearly 2,200-mile stretch of wilderness that wound through the eastern United States. For me, it wasn't just about the physical challenge, though that was a big part of it, but also the solitude and peace I imagined I'd find there. I wanted to leave behind the noise of my everyday life, the constant pings of notifications, and the suffocating routine of a 9-to-5 job. So, when I finally saved enough vacation days and bought the necessary gear, I set out with a plan to tackle the trail, or at least a significant portion of it. I started my journey in early April, when the weather was warming but still crisp enough to make hiking comfortable. My pack was heavy, laden with everything I'd need: a tent, a sleeping bag, food supplies, a first aid kit, and a map. I planned my route meticulously, aiming to cover around 20 miles a day. The trail was everything I'd hoped for: serene, beautiful, and alive with the sounds of nature. I'd pass other hikers occasionally, exchanging brief pleasantries or trail tips, but for the most part, I was alone, and that was exactly how I wanted it. By the third day, I had settled into a rhythm. I'd wake up at dawn, pack up my camp, and hike until late afternoon, stopping only for short breaks to eat or take in the view. That evening, I found a quiet spot to set up my tent just off the trail, near a small stream. The sound of the water was soothing, and I fell asleep quickly, feeling a sense of contentment I hadn't experienced in years. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. As I was packing up, I noticed footprints near my campsite. They weren't mine. The tread was different, and they were fresher than the ones I'd left the day before. I brushed it off as another hiker passing through. Maybe they'd stopped to refill their water bottle at the stream and then moved on. Still, a small part of me felt uneasy. The trail was vast, and campsites were plentiful. Why would someone come so close to mine? I pushed the thought to the back of my mind and continued on my way. The day's hike was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was irrational, I told myself. Paranoia, nothing more. But every time I stopped to rest, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees for movement. The woods were quiet, save for the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. Still, the sense of unease lingered. That night, I chose a campsite farther from the trail, hoping the added distance would give me peace of mind. I cooked a simple meal on my portable stove, then crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. I just started to doze off when I heard it: the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. My heart leapt into my throat. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear more. The footsteps stopped, then resumed, slower this time, as if whoever was out there was trying to be quiet. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, aiming the beam toward the sound. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The footsteps stopped. For what felt like an eternity, I listened, the silence pressing in on me. Finally, I convinced myself it must have been an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon. I turned off the flashlight and tried to go back to sleep, but my rest was fitful, and every rustle of leaves outside set my nerves on edge. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. A single boot print just outside my tent. It was large, likely a man's, and pointed directly toward where I'd been sleeping. My first instinct was to pack up and leave immediately, but I reminded myself that the trail was generally safe. Thousands of people hiked it every year without incident. Maybe someone had wandered close by mistake, or perhaps it was an overzealous wildlife enthusiast checking out my setup. Still, I couldn't ignore the knot of fear in my stomach. As I hiked that day, I kept my eyes peeled for other hikers. The trail was busier now that I was closer to a popular section, and I passed a few groups of people, exchanging polite nods and brief conversations. None of them seemed out of the ordinary, but I couldn't help wondering if one of them had been near my tent the night before. I studied their faces, their gear, their boots, searching for anything that might match the print I'd seen. Nothing stood out. That evening, I decided to stay at a shelter, one of the wooden lean-tos scattered along the trail where hikers could sleep safely and sometimes find company. There were already a few people there when I arrived. A friendly older couple, a solo woman about my age, and a father and son duo. We chatted over dinner, sharing stories and trail tips. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of security. Surely, whoever had been lurking near my tent wouldn't approach a group. I was wrong. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of the woman's scream. Scrambling out of my sleeping bag, I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on. The beam of light revealed her standing near the edge of the shelter, pointing into the darkness. "There was someone out there," she said, her voice shaking. "I saw him." The rest of us quickly gathered around her, trying to calm her down and figure out what had happened. She explained that she'd woken up to use the bathroom and had seen a man standing just beyond the tree line, watching the shelter. When she'd shown her flashlight on him, he turned and disappeared into the woods. The father, clearly unsettled but trying to reassure his son, suggested we all stay close together for the rest of the night. No one got much sleep. By morning, the group decided to stick together and hike to the nearest town, where they could report the incident. I considered going with them, but ultimately decided to continue on my planned route. I didn't want to cut my trip short because of a few unnerving encounters. For the next few days, I saw no sign of the mysterious man. My nerves began to settle, and I convinced myself that the worst was behind me. But then, one evening, as I was setting up camp, I found something that shattered my sense of safety entirely. A small pile of rocks arranged in a deliberate pattern directly in front of my tent. It wasn't natural, someone had placed them there. I looked around, my heart pounding, but saw no one. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. I clutched my pocket knife tightly, knowing it was a poor defense against anyone truly determined to harm me. As dawn broke, I packed up and began hiking before the sun fully rose, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and whoever was following me. Over the next several days, the signs became more frequent. Footprints near my camp, small objects left in conspicuous places, and once, the unmistakable feeling of being watched as I hiked. I'd hear twigs snapping behind me but see nothing when I turned around. I started making deliberate detours, leaving the trail and cutting through dense woods to shake off whoever might be tracking me. But no matter what I did, the signs persisted. Eventually, I reached a section of the trail that passed near a small town. I decided to take a break and reevaluate my plan. At a local diner, I struck up a conversation with a park ranger and told him about my experiences. He listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he told me there had been reports of a man stalking hikers in the area over the past few months. Authorities hadn't been able to catch him yet, but they were actively investigating. The ranger advised me to stay in populated areas of the trail and to consider ending my hike early. I agreed, though the thought of cutting my trip short filled me with disappointment. That night, I stayed at a crowded campsite near the town, surrounded by other hikers. For the first time in weeks, I felt safe enough to sleep soundly. The next morning, I decided to hike to the nearest trailhead and arrange for transportation back home. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I told myself it was just paranoia, a lingering effect of the past few weeks. But then, as I rounded a bend, I saw him. He was standing in the middle of the trail, about 50 feet ahead of me. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore a dark hoodie and cargo pants. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then he took a step toward me. Adrenaline surged through my veins. I turned and ran, my pack bouncing against my back. Behind me, I could hear his footsteps, heavy and fast. I didn't dare look back. My only thought was to get to safety, to find other hikers or a ranger station. The trail seemed endless, each step an eternity. Finally, I spotted a group of hikers up ahead and screamed for help. The man stopped chasing me as soon as he saw the group. He turned and disappeared into the woods without a word. Shaking and out of breath, I explained what had happened to the hikers, who immediately escorted me to the nearest ranger station. There, I filed a report and gave a detailed description of the man. To my knowledge, he was never caught. The rangers assured me they'd increase patrols in the area and warned other hikers to be vigilant. I returned home, my dream of completing the Appalachian Trail shattered. Though I was safe, the experience left a scar that no amount of time could fully heal. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced I hear footsteps outside my window. The trail, once a symbol of freedom and peace, has become a reminder of how quickly paradise can turn to peril. The Appalachian Trail had always been a place of intrigue for me, not because of its beauty or the promise of solitude, but because of the stories, the whispers of things that went wrong, people who disappeared, and legends passed between hikers. I'm not much of an adventurer. In fact, my friends would call me the exact opposite. But there was something about the trail's dark undercurrent that called to me, as if daring me to prove I could handle it. I wanted to understand why it drew people in and sometimes why it spat them back out. I wasn't going to hike the entire 2,200 miles. My plan was modest. A week-long trek through a section of the trail known for its scenic views and challenging climbs. It was mid-October, the kind of autumn where the leaves exploded into fiery colors, and the chill in the air made you grateful for every ray of sunlight. I packed the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a sturdy map. My gear wasn't top of the line, but it was reliable. I figured that would be enough. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. The trail was everything I expected. Rugged but manageable, peaceful but alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. I passed a few other hikers, most of them heading in the opposite direction. We exchanged nods, the kind of polite acknowledgement that said, "We're all in this together, but let's keep our distance." I liked it that way. The solitude was part of the appeal. On the third day, things began to feel off. It started with small things: a misplaced rock pile, a broken branch that looked freshly snapped, even though no one else should have been nearby. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination. The woods can play tricks on you, especially when you're alone. But as the day wore on, the feeling grew stronger, an unshakable sense that I wasn't alone. That night, I camped near a stream, a spot recommended in one of the trail guides. The sound of the water was supposed to be soothing, but instead, it felt like it masked other noises, subtle ones that I couldn't quite identify. As I cooked my dinner, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there. But the woods were empty, or so it seemed. I crawled into my tent early, telling myself I was just tired. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by the wind rustling the trees and the occasional snap of a twig. At one point, I thought I heard breathing, slow, deliberate, and too close. My hand crept to the knife I kept by my sleeping bag, but when I held my breath and listened, the sound was gone. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe an animal, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach churn. Footprints. They weren't mine. The tread was different, and they circled my campsite, stopping just a few feet from my tent. Whoever it was had been standing there, watching me. I packed up in record time and hit the trail, moving faster than I'd planned. My goal was to reach the next shelter by midday and reassess my situation. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I'd stop occasionally, pretending to adjust my pack, and listen. There it was, the faint crunch of leaves, the almost imperceptible snap of a twig. Someone was out there, matching my pace. I considered confronting them, but what would I say? What if it wasn't a person at all, but my imagination running wild? By the time I reached the shelter, my nerves were frayed. The wooden structure was empty, save for a few graffiti carvings and an old, weathered journal left behind by other hikers. I flipped through the pages, hoping for some distraction. Most of the entries were mundane, detailing trail conditions or funny anecdotes. But one entry caught my eye. Written in shaky handwriting, it read, "If you're reading this, don't stay here alone. He comes at night." I slammed the journal shut and looked around, my heart pounding. The shelter suddenly felt too exposed, too vulnerable. I decided to push on, Even though my legs ached and the sun was dipping lower in the sky, I'd find another spot, somewhere less conspicuous. As darkness fell, I settled on a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. I set up my tent quickly, skipping dinner in favor of crawling inside and zipping myself in tight. I kept my knife close, my headlamp within reach. Sleep didn't come easy, and when it did, it was shallow and restless. I woke abruptly to a sound that froze me in place. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and circling my tent. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, every muscle in my body tense. Whoever it was didn't speak, didn't try to open the tent. They just walked, around and around, like a predator stalking its prey. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, clutching my knife and praying they'd go away. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything, but the woods had gone eerily silent. When the first light of dawn filtered through the fabric of my tent, I finally unzipped it and stepped outside. The ground was littered with footprints, too many to count, all circling my tent. My heart sank as I realized they weren't just from one person. There had been multiple people out there. I didn't bother eating or breaking down my tent properly. I stuffed everything into my pack and started walking, my only goal to get off the trail as quickly as possible. I didn't care about my route or the scenery anymore. I just wanted to be somewhere safe. As the hours passed, I began to hear voices. At first, I thought I was imagining them, but they grew louder, more distinct. They weren't shouting or calling out. They were murmuring, low and conspiratorial. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unsettling. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw them. 3 men, standing in the middle of the trail, blocking my path. They were dressed in mismatched outdoor gear, their faces obscured by hoods and scarves. One of them held a long hunting knife, the blade catching the sunlight. They didn't say anything, just stood there, watching me. I froze, my mind racing. Running didn't seem like an option. They'd catch me easily. Confronting them felt equally hopeless. My only chance was to play it cool, to act like I wasn't terrified out of my mind. "Hey," I said, my voice shaking despite my best effort to sound calm. "I'm just passing through." They didn't respond. One of them took a step forward, and I instinctively backed away. "Look," I continued, "I don't want any trouble. I'll just go back the way I came." Still no response. The man with the knife raised it slightly, as if to make a point. That's when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Someone else, emerging from the trees to my left. They were surrounding me. Panic took over. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush and off the trail. Branches tore at my face and clothes, but I didn't care. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps heavy and unrelenting. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes? Hours? Time lost all meaning. Eventually, I stumbled into a clearing and collapsed, gasping for air. The woods were silent again, but I knew better than to trust it. I forced myself to keep moving, though every step felt like a monumental effort. Just as the sun began to set, I saw a building in the distance, a ranger station. I almost cried with relief. I staggered toward it, pounding on the door with what little strength I had left. A ranger opened it, his eyes widening as he took in my disheveled appearance. "Help!" I managed to choke out. "They're after me." He ushered me inside and locked the door behind me. As I told him what had happened, his expression grew darker. "You're not the first," he said grimly. "We've had reports of strange activity in this area, but we haven't been able to catch anyone." I spent the night at the station, too afraid to sleep. The next morning, the ranger escorted me to the nearest town, where I caught a ride back home. I never set foot on the Appalachian Trail again. To this day, I don't know who those men were or what they wanted. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about the footprints around my tent, the murmured voices, and the glint of that knife. And I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for their next victim. The Appalachian Trail has always been a beacon for adventurers and solitude seekers. Stretching over 2,000 miles across the eastern United States, it promises breathtaking views, the humbling embrace of nature, and the challenge of pushing one's limits. For me, it was none of those things. I wasn't an avid hiker, nor did I have a deep love for the wilderness. My reason for stepping foot on that legendary trail was far more personal. I was running. I don't mean running in the literal sense, though I did plenty of that later. I was running from my life, my mistakes, and the suffocating city that seemed to mock me at every turn. A bad breakup, a dead-end job, and a pile of debt had left me feeling like a cornered animal. The trail offered an escape, a reset button, a chance to lose myself in something bigger and older than the mess I'd made. So, I packed a bag with borrowed gear, downloaded a trail map, and told myself I'd figure out the rest as I went. I chose a section of the trail in Virginia, known for its moderate difficulty and sparse crowds. It wasn't the most remote part of the Appalachian Trail, but it wasn't exactly crowded either. Perfect for someone who wanted to disappear for a while. I planned a week-long trek, just enough to clear my head, but not so long that I'd completely fall off the grid. My phone, useless for calls in most parts of the trail, was loaded with offline maps and an emergency contact app. I'd assured my brother, the only person I'd bothered to tell about my trip, that I'd check in once I got back. The first 2 days were uneventful. The trail was everything I'd read about. Rugged yet beautiful, with stretches of dense forest that opened into stunning vistas. I passed a few hikers along the way, most of them cheerful and eager to swap stories. We'd exchange polite nods or a quick, "Stay safe out there," and then move on. It was exactly what I needed, just enough human contact to keep me grounded, but not enough to feel overwhelmed. On the third day, things started to change. It began with a sense of unease, a prickling at the back of my neck that I couldn't shake. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination. The woods have a way of making you feel watched, even when you're alone. But as the day wore on, the feeling grew stronger. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, scanning the trees for movement. I told myself it was nothing, just my city-dweller nerves reacting to the unfamiliar solitude. That evening, I set up camp near a small clearing, not far from a bubbling creek. The sound of the water was comforting, a natural white noise that helped drown out the rustling of the forest. As I cooked a simple meal on my portable stove, I tried to shake off the paranoia that had been building all day. "You're fine," I muttered to myself. "It's just the woods. Nothing out here but squirrels and deer." Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves jolted me awake, my heart pounding. Around midnight, I thought I heard faint footsteps outside my tent. They were slow and deliberate, circling the perimeter. I held my breath, clutching the small knife I kept by my side. But when I finally mustered the courage to unzip the tent and shine my flashlight into the darkness, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. By morning, I'd convinced myself it had been an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a curious deer. I packed up quickly, eager to put some distance between myself and whatever had spooked me. But as I started down the trail, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. They weren't mine. The tread was different, wider, and they led away from my campsite in the direction I was heading. I'm not a tracker by any means, but the prints looked fresh. I hesitated, debating whether to follow them or take a detour. The map showed a side trail a few miles ahead that would loop back to the main path. It was longer, but it seemed like the safer option. With a deep breath, I decided to stick to my original route for now. Maybe I'd run into another hiker and get some reassurance that I wasn't alone out here. The day passed in a blur of cautious steps and constant glances over my shoulder. I didn't see another soul. The footprints reappeared occasionally, always ahead of me, as if whoever made them was just out of sight. My nerves were shot by the time I reached the next shelter, a simple wooden structure with 3 walls and a slanted roof. I'd planned to camp here for the night, but the thought of staying in an open shelter with no door made my skin crawl. Inside, I found a logbook left by other hikers. Most of the entries were cheerful notes about the trail, but one stood out. Scrawled in shaky handwriting, it read, "He's out here. Stay together. Don't hike alone. My blood ran cold. I flipped back a few pages, searching for more entries by the same person, but there was nothing else. Just that one chilling warning. I slammed the book shut and looked around, half expecting someone to appear out of the woods. The shelter suddenly felt too exposed, too vulnerable. I decided to keep moving, even though the sun was sinking lower in the sky. As darkness fell, I found a small clearing off the main trail and set up my tent. I didn't bother cooking dinner, opting instead to eat a protein bar inside the relative safety of my tent. Sleep was out of the question. I lay there with my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, listening to every sound. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. Whoever it was wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The footsteps stopped, but I could feel their presence, just outside the thin fabric of my tent. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching my knife and praying they wouldn't come any closer. When the first light of morning filtered through the trees, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my legs shaking. The ground was covered in footprints, circling my tent like a predator stalking its prey. My stomach churned as I realized they weren't just from one person. There had been multiple people out there. I packed up in record time and started down the trail, my heart racing with every step. The goal was simple: get off the trail and back to civilization as quickly as possible. I didn't care about my planned route or the beautiful views I'd hoped to see. Survival was the only thing on my mind. As I hiked, I began to hear voices. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the rustling of leaves. But they grew louder, more distinct. They weren't speaking English, or if they were, the words were too distorted to understand. I quickened my pace, my pulse pounding in my ears. And then I saw them. 3 figures stood in the middle of the trail, blocking my path. They wore mismatched clothing, their faces obscured by hoods and scarves. One of them held a long hunting knife, the blade catching the sunlight. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, watching me. "I don't want any trouble," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll just go back the way I came." Still no response. One of them took a step forward, and I instinctively backed away. That's when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. Another figure emerging from the trees to my left. They were surrounding me. Panic took over. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush and off the trail. Branches tore at my face and arms, but I didn't care. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps heavy and relentless. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't stop until I stumbled into a clearing and collapsed. The woods were silent again, but I knew better than to trust it. I forced myself to keep moving, every step a struggle. Just as the sun began to set, I saw a building in the distance, a ranger station. I almost cried with relief. I staggered toward it, pounding on the door with what little strength I had left. A ranger opened it, his eyes widening as he took in my disheveled appearance. "Help!" I gasped. "They're after me." He ushered me inside and locked the door behind me. As I recounted what had happened, his expression grew darker. "You're not the first," he said grimly. "We've had reports of strange activity in this area, but we haven't been able to catch anyone." I spent the night at the station, too afraid to sleep. The next morning, the ranger escorted me to the nearest town, where I caught a ride back home. I never set foot on the Appalachian Trail again. To this day, I don't know who those people were or what they wanted. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about the footprints around my tent, the murmured voices, and the glint of that knife. And I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for their next victim.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for supporting this channel. It truly means a lot. As a broke college student editing all my videos on an Android phone, it takes a lot of effort to bring these stories to life. A laptop would help me create better content faster, so if you enjoy my work, please subscribe and share. Your support makes all the difference. Thank you so much.